Morning or afternoon. I am presenting for myself and Erin, Leister, Chaussee, who has been my graduate student, but now is a doctoral, has her doctorate in biostatistics. And I have to say that she is responsible for most of the really technical parts of this and a lot of things that I've learned in the last 2 or 3 years. So my outline is I'm going to talk about the step wedge design, and briefly give you an overview, and then present a checklist for feasibility. You know, is this the right design for your study? And then I'm going to go to an example, what we call decide LVAD, and show how the the checklist worked, and then finally follow up with a few other challenges of implementing and analyzing a step wedge design. So the step wedge design is a hybrid of a cluster randomized study and a crossover design. The crossover is unidirectional, so we always go from control to intervention. And the time of the crossover is randomized. There are two versions. One is the one that is most used and the only one I have experience with, and it's the cross-sectional, where the enrollment of individuals is continuous, and the time of the enrollment determines which treatment the individual is assigned to. The second one is a cohort study where all of the individuals are enrolled at the beginning, and the crossover from control to intervention occurs within the individual. So what are the reasons for choosing a stepped wedge design? Really, if you were trying to demonstrate efficacy of an intervention, it's probably not the best design. But if you're really looking at effectiveness, how it works in a clinical setting, or you want to study the implementation of the design, it has a lot of advantages. The other reasons for choosing the design is it's much more efficient than a cluster randomized design. It's less efficient than randomization at the individual level. There isn't anything better than that. But when you're worried about things like contamination, and you know that you have to randomize at a site level, then it's more efficient than the cluster randomized design. There are logistical and financial reasons. Maybe the logistics are that there's training needed for the implementation, and you can't do that simultaneous at all the sites. Financial is sometimes, the grant just won't support more than 6 to 10 sites. It won't support the 25 sites that are needed for a cluster randomized trial. And there's a slight advantage in recruitment of sites, because eventually all the sites will get the intervention, and a lot of times they're, knowing that they will experience the intervention makes it easier to recruit sites. So the most typical statistical model for these designs was documented by Hussey and Hughes in 2007. And it basically, the treatment effect theta is a fixed effect, and the Xij is 0 if you're in the control period, or 1 if a patient is recruited in the intervention period. Bij allows you to model time effects over time. So if something happens and CMS changes their policy or something like that, it allows you to model that. The assumption is in this model that it's constant over all of the clusters or all the sites, that if it happens, all the sites will be similarly affected. And then there's random effects to explain the difference between clusters, variation between clusters, or a residual error, EIJK, that models the individual variation within a cluster. And one of the key issues in determining the sample size in a cluster randomized trial is what we call the interclass correlation, and that's the correlations of individuals within a cluster. And in the next slide, you can, next slide, you can see the contrast between the power in a stepped wedge design and a cluster randomized design, and how it's affected by the interclass correlation. This example has 6 sites, and you can see as the interclass correlation increases, the power in the cluster randomized trial really declines quite dramatically, whereas the step wedge design stays fairly constant. And that's because you're getting information on subjects under both conditions, both in the control and the intervention. So is this the best thing since sliced bread? You know, why wouldn't we always use a stepped wedge design versus a cluster randomized trial? And so the rest of the presentation is really going to talk about my experience with a stepped wedge trial and work on other projects that led me to develop a checklist for feasibility. I basically kind of go through this checklist when somebody shows up in my office and says, you know, I've heard about this great design and we want to do it, you know, because we will need a smaller sample size. And I go, okay, there's a bunch of questions that we need to answer before we jump into this. And there might be a reason not to do a stepped wedge design. So the first part of the checklist are administrative issues. So is it feasible to start enrollment at all sites at the same time? And, you know, coordinating IRBs and subcontracts, hiring of study personnel at each site, that all needs to be done before you can start even one site. You can't start one site and, you know, wait for the others to catch up. You got to start everybody at the same time. And then the other issue is there likelihood of sites dropping out during the trial? Because if sites drop out during the trial, what it does is it significantly decreases the number of patients that are randomized to the intervention arm. and that could have a significant impact on your power for your study. The next issue is about accrual and selection bias. Are all the sites committed to, accrue evenly over the control periods and the intervention periods? If they're saying, well, we'll just get a few on while we're in the control, and oh, when the intervention comes on, we want to pull in all of our patients. That doesn't work in this design. All the sites have to be committed to this even accrual. But probably more critical is the pool of potential participants large enough so that you're getting similar patients over time. What you don't want to do is have a study where patients are recruited, for example, when they come in for a clinic visit, because what will happen is the earliest patients will be the sickest patients because they have more clinic visits. And so you need to figure out a way that you either have a very large or renewing pool of patients, and some way to avoid selection bias as you're recruiting patients. And I saw one study where the intervention actually changed the eligibility, and that was kind of a disaster because you're comparing different patients in the control arm to patients in the intervention arm. This is where we stumble the most, and it has to do with the crossover, that change from the control to the intervention. And can it happen in a specific time point? So the duration of the intervention needs to be fairly short, so that you don't have contamination of those people that were accrued during the control arm when you start recruiting patients in the intervention arm. And also the duration of follow-up needs to be fairly short or contamination unlikely, so that, again, as you're following up patients in the control arm, what you're doing for patients in the intervention arm isn't likely to contaminate their follow-up assessments. And then how much training is required? Do you need several months of practice for the people delivering the intervention? And that's going to create problems. And some of the red flags for a need for a washout period, it is that requirement for training and practice, or extended duration of the intervention, or again, potential contamination of the follow-up. And so if we might decide that we're going to insert this washout period in the study, and this is how it would have looked like in the example I'm going to describe later. And so you have a washout period where you're really not collecting any information that would allow follow-up or training, or everything I've been talking about. But the issue is let's say you had a design that required 840 patients for the entire study to get 80% power. If you didn't have the washout period, but if you inserted a washout period in this particular example, it would drop the power to 66%, which is fairly dramatic decrease. Or to overcome that, you would have to increase your sample size by 40% to get back up close to that 80% power. And then the fourth part of the checklist, what is the likelihood that, there are events or changes in policy that might occur at some sites, but not sites. There is some proposed alternative analytical models for doing this, but they would be need to be pre-specified, and it's going to make the analysis much more difficult. And the literature on this is really evolving at this point. So going to our example, this is a trial done by Drs. Larry Allen and Dan Matlock here at the University of Colorado. That the intervention is a decision aid for having LVAD, which is a left ventricular assist device implementation for patients with heart failure. And the goals were to study effectiveness and implementation. The outcomes were knowledge about the procedure and values treatment concordance. If they wanted to extend their quality of life versus they wanted to extend their survival. And there were six centers in this trial. And as we saw before, this is the results from the trial. And kind of to notice a few things in this table. The accrual did decline over time. There was more accrual early on than there was later on, and it resulted in a smaller sample size in the intervention. That turned out to be okay. But we also saw changes in the characteristics of the patients over time. And I'll come back to this point later. So going back to the checklist, starting all the sites at one time, we did have one site that started late, but only by 1 month. And it didn't result in any of those cells having zero accrual. So the time period for each one of those steps was longer than 1 month. So that didn't turn out to be a big issue, but it could have been. And all the sites did complete the study. One site stopped enrollment for a short period in the time in the middle of the study, but again, there were, didn't result in no patients during that time period. So accrual, are there similar levels of commitment throughout both phases? Well, accrual did decline in most of the sites over time. One site did go up. So there were more in the control than the intervention, but since we over accrued by quite a bit, it turned out not to be a problem, but it could have been a problem. And is the pool large enough to avoid selection bias? We thought that this wasn't going to be an issue because, people come in to have this procedure and it seemed like there was going to be a renewing pool, but it turned out that the characteristics of that pool did change over time. And we had more outpatients later on the study, so we had a higher proportion in the intervention. We had a decrease in the proportion who had longer diagnoses, so we were getting patients with more recent diagnoses, and we were having more of those most recent diagnoses in the intervention. Now, these are two characteristics that we measured, and by being able to put them in the model, we were able to get around this problem. You know, the question is, were there other characteristics that we didn't measure, and then they could be considered confounders in this study. So the next issue is the crossover. So the duration of the intervention was basically a single session where patients viewed the pamphlet and the video. So the intervention was very short. Contamination was unlikely follow-up, you know, how follow-up was not impacted by what was happening in the new patients who were being recruited under the intervention. And the training was pretty brief and straightforward. There really wasn't any practice needed by the staff. What was mostly needed was changes in the policies and the practices of getting the pamphlets and the videos to the patients. They're being offered consistently. And then the issue of time trends, it was really considered unlikely that changes in the standard of care, or you know, some well-known person having this procedure were likely to change things differentially across the sites. They would be likely to impact all the sites. So we thought this was a pretty good trial to implement a stepped wedge. So what are some of the other challenges that weren't on my checklist? Sample size calculations are pretty straightforward if all the sites are the same size and they're all going to have even accrual. But you know that's not going to be the norm. And so you know, the software that's really readily available makes this assumption. Erin and some of my colleagues are working on our script to figure out how to have a more flexible way of calculating the sample sizes. But you know, site sizes are variable. You can kind of guess about that. The washout is a critical issue, and if there are other non-standard ways that you want to adopt this, it's going to require a very sophisticated statistician to be able to implement that. Randomization is something that needs to be thought about. Obviously, balancing sites by their size requires identifying which are going to be the small ones and which are going to be the large ones. If there are site level covariates like academic versus non-academic, urban versus rural, it would be ideal to balance those to make sure you didn't get you know, all the rural sites being randomized to the control group or whatever. And then some of the participant level covariates that might vary by site. It needs to be thought about. And then the analysis methods. Chaussee and Hughes model is very straightforward and quite robust. But it may not address all the concerns. And if you don't have a statistician who's sophisticated enough to be able to defend the Hussey and Hughes model, you may be in trouble with reviewers. There are other issues, and there's so much research that's coming out every year. You can see how many papers have come out in, less than the last 5 years, talking about variable time effects by cluster, or variable effects, treatment effects by clusters, or treatment varying over time, or there's just a lot of ways, and it definitely it requires somebody who is familiar with these models, is familiar with the literature, which is very vast, to be able to defend the analysis and the proposal. So in summary, to step wedge or not. So think about the checklist and make sure that you have strong statistical support. And you might look at some other discussions. These other ones talk about other issues than some of the ones that I've addressed. And then finally, we have a bunch of, and this is a small proportion of the references that are available, but you can see how much of these have happened in the last 5 years. There's a huge interest in this, and it's definitely an ongoing area of research for statisticians. Thank you very much.